this week we're starting the book of Bamidbar, and it's a tightly organized event that every year we always read the Parsha of Bamidbar just before Shavuot. And, you know, the rabbis designed the cycle such that this will happen inevitably. Some years we have to pack our readings together and have double readings, but the rabbis were very keen to have Sefer Bamidbar begin before the festival of Shavuot. So one of the questions I want to ask is, why is that? Okay, and the Midrash that we're eventually going to look at from this week's Parsha will perhaps give us some insight into that. But before I do, there's another question about Shavuot that I think is worth asking. If you go back a couple of weeks to Parshat Omer, where we have the description of all of the festivals, there's something quite peculiar about the festival of Shavuot. If you notice, Rosh Hashanah, it has a date. In the book of Leviticus, it tells us the date of Rosh Hashanah. It's the first day of the 7th month, the 1st of Tishrei. And it has a characteristic ritual, a ritual that none of the other festivals really have, which is blowing the shofar. And that's mentioned over there in Parshat Omer, in the description of Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur.
I think we lost you, Sam. Can't hear you. We can't hear you.
The 10th of the 7th month. Can you hear me now?
Try not to move from where you are. It was very good.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So I was saying that Yom Kippur also has a date, and it also has a particular ritual. The date is the 10th of Tishrei. The particular ritual that the Torah spells out is to afflict your souls. Okay? There's the festival of Sukkot. It also has a date, the 15th of the 7th month, and it also has its own particular, the Arba Minim, the 4 species, the lulav and etrog. And there's also the idea that we're supposed to dwell in Sukkot for 7 days. Now, you could come at me with Shmini Atzeret, which is the 8th day of Sukkot. That doesn't have any particular ritual, I know, but it's very much tied up with the festival of Sukkot. It's like a conclusion to Sukkot. You have Pesach. Pesach has its own particular date, the 15th of Nisan.
We're getting a distortion in your voice.
Sam, it's not, we cannot hear you.
First month.
Oh.
And its own particular rituals that we have to eat matzah. And not only do all of the festival have clear what the festival is about, I moved to another spot. Let me see. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I'm going to try a different internet connection.
I can hear you.
Spot.
Now it's a bit better.
Deborah, what beautiful light in your apartment.
Hello.
Oh, thank you.
Hello.
Hello. It's we can hear you, but not a bit sketchy.
Hello, everybody.
Better.
I've changed. Hello, I've changed the connection.
Oh.
I'm gonna try again. Let's see. Okay. Okay, I'm here. I'm here. Are you there? No? Um,
I don't know if you're talking, Sam, but we don't hear you at all.
let's try a little bit longer, and if this doesn't work, maybe I'll have to go to someone's house.
What about stopping screen sharing and just talking? Maybe that would work.
Can you send, oh, see, I think he left. There are wonderful things about Zoom, and every once in a while we have,
I've turned my video off in the hope that that will help my bandwidth.
turning my video off, not helping.
Can people hear me?
All right, we'll give it a try.
Hello?
We're gonna give it a
Hello?
try.
It's
Go
not
ahead.
helping. Can you hear
Hello.
me? Give it
Yes,
one more
we can hear you.
try. I really hope this works. So what we've said so far is that all of the festivals have their own specific date and their own
What?
specific ritual. And if we're not told
Pencil. Yeah.
what the fest,
I don't have
If
any
we-
simple pencils.
if we're not,
Oh, let me, this is a disaster. This is
okay,
just not working.
Please, could
Can
you
anybody
mute
hear me?
yourself?
yeah, I can mute.
Not you.
Yeah, okay. All right, you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes,
So,
it's better. It's better than
okay.
it was.
So each of the festivals has its own date and its own ritual. If the Torah doesn't tell us what the day's about, from the ritual, we can pretty much work it something out. Yom Kippur means Day of Atonement, so we know it's got something to do with forgiveness for sins. Is about shofar blowing. Now, that's not exactly clear what that means, but you know, it doesn't take much for the rabbis to suggest that it's a day of coronation, of crowning God, because the shofar reminds them of a trumpet. Sukkot and Pesach, not only do we have these rituals, but we're told exactly what they commemorate. Sukkot commemorates the booths in which we dwelled during the wilderness years. And the matzah commemorates the exodus from Egypt. The exceptional festival is Shavuot, because Shavuot doesn't have a date. Instead, it says you just count 49 days from the day after Pesach, or if you're a Sadducee, from the first Sunday after Pesach, depending on how you read the verses. But there's no date. In our fixed calendar, it always works out that it's the 6th of Sivan. But it doesn't have to be that way. And before the fixed calendar, it would sometimes be the 5th, sometimes it might be the 7th of Sivan. It wasn't, so it doesn't have a fixed date. And the other thing is, the Torah doesn't give us any particular ritual. There's no shofar, there's no matzah, there's no sukkah, there's no fasting. And the Torah doesn't tell us what the festival's about. So it's a harvest festival, but so is Sukkot. There's no historical narrative associated with it. It's almost like it's a festival that's in search of an identity. So we have two questions. The first question is, why do we always read Parshat Bamidbar before the festival of Shavuot? And the second question is, what is Shavuot all about? So those are two of the questions I have in the background. Is everybody with me? Okay, good. So, one answer to one of our questions comes from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who writes the following in his magisterial 19 letters. In the 8th letter, he says the following: in the wilderness, it, i.e. the people of Israel, received the Torah, and thus in the wilderness, without land or soil, it became a nation. It became a body whose soul was the Torah, and therefore could be truthfully called Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests. For as the priests in the midst of a single people, was this nation to be in the midst of universal mankind, preserving the law of God and practicing and fulfilling its holy precepts. Goy Kadosh, holy nation, was also to be its appellation, for throughout the fulfillment of the divine law, it was to become holy, not participating in the worldly doings of other nations, but preaching the sacredness of humanity by the example of its life. The Torah, the fulfillment of the divine will, was to be its soil and country and aim. Its national existence, therefore, was neither dependent upon nor conditioned by transitory things, but eternal as the spirit, the soul, and the world of the eternal one. What I take from this excerpt is that for Rabbi Hirsch, it wasn't a coincidence that the Torah was given in the desert. The Torah was given in the desert because it was vital that the Jewish people define itself not around the notion of a promised land or a homeland. Indeed, we have a promised land and we want to live there. And we have all sorts of laws about how to make the promised land and our sovereignty over it a success. However, our nationhood is prior to such worldly and transitory things as sovereignty over a particular stretch of land. And our mission is more global than a particular nation state whose mission is perhaps local to its own borders. We are summoned to be a nation of priests, and as such, we have a mission to be among the peoples of this world, to spread the light of ethical monotheism, to be a light unto the nations. And indeed, God knew that for many thousands of years, or at least for 2,000 years, the Jewish people would be a people in exile. And therefore, it was essential that we should define ourselves not around a homeland, but around the principles and ideals of the Torah. So perhaps one suggestion is, okay, we all know, I don't know how we know it yet, but we all know that the festival of Shavuot celebrates the giving of the Torah. So Rabbi Hirsch says, the giving of the Torah has to happen in the desert. Now, the book of Bamidbar is a book about the existence of the Jewish people for 40 years in the desert. And indeed, that's why it's called Bamidbar, in the desert. The story of Bamidbar was destined to be very short. It starts from about a year after the Exodus from Egypt, and the Jewish people are still camped around Mount Sinai, having built their tabernacle, their Mishkan. And it was supposed to be a short, month or so walk to get to Israel and enter the promised land. So the book of Bamidbar could have been a very short story. But as we all know, the episode of the 10 spies and all sorts of other fractious episodes in the book of Numbers kind of reveals to us that this very short and simple journey was not to be. And indeed, in the aftermath of in the fallout of the episode of the 10 spies, God decrees that this nation will wander around for 40 years in the desert. We'll come back to it. But Rabbi Hirsch's point is, we really should enter the desert before we receive the Torah, because it wasn't by accident that the Torah was given in the desert. So that's why perhaps we read the book of Bamidbar before we open the book of Bamidbar before we receive the Torah on Shavuot. But notice that this answer only addresses one of our questions. We had two questions. One, why do we always begin the book of Bamidbar before the festival of Shavuot? And two, why, where does Shavuot get its identity from? Why is it the festival of Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah? How do we even know that? Okay, is everyone with me still? I'm just checking on the sound. Good, okay.
Yeah.
So now, I want to share with you another suggestion that has the power perhaps to answer both of our questions. And this comes from the Maharal of Prague. This is a very scary statue of him, but it's the only picture I could find of him. This is the statue of him in Prague. And he has a commentary on all of the Agadic, or many of the Agadic passages of the Talmud. The Agadita, the Agadic parts of the Talmud, are the non-halachic parts, the parts that don't deal with law, but deal more with story, legend, Midrash, and the like. And the Gemara in Baba Metzia, it says that the only reason that Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70 was because the Jews were too strict in the way they judged one another. They judged one another according to the scrupulous letter of Jewish law, and they never went beyond the letter of the law. And in response to that Gemara, the Maharal writes the following, and I translated myself, so I've got nobody to blame if it's not particularly good. Here it goes. Jerusalem was only destroyed because the Jews were too strict in their Torah law, which is to say, it wouldn't have been destroyed even if they had other sins to their names. The Holy One, blessed be He, would have punished them some other way, and there would have been no destruction. But since they stood their own words up according to the words of the law, and they only wanted to do things according to strict justice, God took them beyond the letter of the law. Let's say two people had a financial dispute and it was over a small amount of money. You know, if you're a stickler for justice, you might take that person to court, even for a small amount of money. But, you know, some people are just willing to let things go. Unfortunately, the generation of the temple, the second temple, the last generation of the second temple, were not willing to let things go. They were sticklers for the law. And therefore, God also wasn't willing to let things go when the Jewish people didn't act, so to speak, perfectly, right? And since they were drawn after strict justice in all of the deeds, all of their deeds, and they judged each other according to strict justice, Jerusalem was destroyed. And this is hinted to in the fact that the Torah was given in a place of destruction, which is the wilderness. And there, God gave Israel the Torah. But if they had not judged according to strict law, and they had gone beyond the letter of the law, the destruction would not have occurred. Moreover, know that there certainly were other sins, as is explained in Omer. In Tractate Omer, the Gemara lays out a number of bad things the Jewish people were doing in those days. Nevertheless, says the Maharal, based on this Gemara in Baba Metzia, nevertheless, if they all went beyond the letter of the law with one another, the Holy One, blessed be he, would have showed them favor. The idea that the Maharal is getting at here is that, unlike Rabbi Hirsch, God gave us the Torah in the desert, not merely to illustrate to us that our national identity comes before homeland, sovereignty, and borders. No. God gave us the Torah in the desert to illustrate to us how destructive the Torah can be. If all we do is live by the laws of the Torah, we will live in a desert, a place of destruction. So to speak, job is to go beyond the letter of the law. The Torah that was given to us serves as something like a bare minimum, but we are enjoined upon to go further than the bare minimum laid out by the Torah. In other words, to kind of stretch the metaphor of the Maharal, we are enjoined upon to make that desert bloom. He carries on. He says, and so the sages explain in Tractate Brachot 20b. The rabbis over there have a puzzle, and the puzzle is this. There's one place in the Torah where God is described as showing no favor and taking no bribes. However, in the priestly blessing, we say, Yisa Hashem panav elecha. May God show you favor. May God shine his face upon you. So what's the deal? Is God a God who shows people favor? Is God a God who has favorites? Is God a God who, so to speak, can be bribed? Or is God above all of that? And the two verses conflict. And the Gemara in Brachot explains as follows, as summarized by the Maharal. He says, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, how can I not show favor to Israel? Since I wrote, be satiated and bless. So there is a biblical commandment to say Birkat Hamazon, to say a benediction after eating. But the biblical commandment is only in force when you are satiated. Now, many times, Jewish people have lived through terrible poverty. And this means that they're very rarely satiated, if ever. And therefore, according to the strict letter of the Torah, they would never have needed to have said a benediction after eating, because they were never satiated. And yet, rabbinic law enjoins upon us to say a blessing whenever you've eaten just an olive bulk of bread. According to some, it was an egg bulk of bread. So the Holy One, blessed be he, said, look, how can I not show favor? Since I wrote that you shall eat and be satiated and blessed, and even so, they are particular to bless over a measly olive bulk or an egg bulk. Therefore, if they went beyond the letter of the law, the Holy One, blessed be he, would also have gone beyond the letter of the law with them. If we live by a law that is supposed to say richer than the mere minimum requirements of the 5 books of Moses, if we enrich the laws of Moses and go further than the mere letter and enter into the spirit of the law, and we allow that spirit to animate us, then God will also go beyond the letter of the law with us. And even though we all have sins to our names, because Ein Sadik Ba'aret Shelo Yechta, there is no righteous person on earth who doesn't have a sin to his name, God can overlook it if we're the sorts of people who overlook things. But if we're not the sort of people to overlook things, then God won't treat us like that. God will treat us according to the strict letter of the law. And that's why, according to the Maharal, Jerusalem was destroyed. So what I want to do in order to use this to explain something about the nature of Shavuot, I want to supplement the Maharal with the first of today's Midrashim. This is a Midrash from a fascinating and somewhat more obscure connection called Tana Debei Eliyahu, which is something like the Midrashim of the school of a rabbi called Eliyahu. And this is from a section of that Midrash called Seder Eliyahu Zuta. And it's really quite charming because it's written more like a story from the perspective of Eliyahu. I was walking around here, and I was a rabbi called Eliyahu. I was walking around here, and this person asked me this question. I was walking around here, and another person asked me another question. And where we meet Eliyahu in this excerpt, he's just met a Sadducee who says, do you really believe that the Torah came along with all of these rabbinic injunctions? For example, the Torah says you only have to say a benediction after eating if you're saying it. Do you really believe the rabbis have the authority to step in and say, no, you should say it even if you're not satiated, as long as you've eaten an olive bulk? Do they really have that authority? Where does that come from? And this was Eliyahu's answer. He said, well, to what can it be compared? To a king of flesh and blood who had 2 servants, okay? Both of whom he loved unconditionally. He gave one a small measure of wheat and a small bunch of flax, and he gave the other a small measure of wheat and a bunch of flax. What did the clever one of the two do? He took the flax and he weaved a cloth, and he took the wheat and he made flour, which he then sifted, ground finely, kneaded, and baked into bread, placed on the table, and spread that linen cloth that he'd made over it until the king came back. The foolish one did nothing with what he was given. After some time, the king came back to his house and said to them, my sons, bring me what I gave to you. So one brought out the bread upon the table with the tablecloth upon it. The other brought out the wheat in a box and a bunch of flax upon it. Woe to this one because of the embarrassment. Woe to this one because of the shame. Now consider which was most dear to the king. and this Midrash ends with Eliyahu saying, Rabbi Eliyahu saying, Kishanatana Kadosh Baruch Hu Torah Yisrael, when the Holy One, blessed be He, gave Torah to Israel, Lo nitna lahen ela kechitim lahotzi mehen solet. He gave it to them as flour, as wheat, that required us to take and make into flour. Upishtan, He gave it to us like flax, making it incumbent upon us, lahotzi mimenu beged, to make clothing from it, to make fabric from it. So the idea was the Torah was given in order for us to engage with it, almost to embellish it. And it's a very interesting notion when the rabbis talk about going beyond the letter of the law. The language that they use is nichnas lifnim mishurat hadin, which literally means to enter in to the letter of the law, not to go beyond it, to enter into it. The suggestion is that the law contains a spirit. And if you really delve into the letter of the law, you'll understand its spirit. And understanding its spirit is what will lead you from time to time to go beyond the letter of the law. So it's not that we're just making stuff up. The wheat has within it the potential to become flour. The flax has within it the potential to become a tablecloth. But we were given this system called Torah Shebal Peh, oral Torah, that allows us to enter into the spirit of the law and to come up with something, I suppose, much richer than the bare bones of the written Torah. And says the Maharal of Prague, the Torah was given in the desert to illustrate symbolically that if all you have is the written Torah, you're living in a desert. That only if you take out the flour from the wheat and take out the fabric from the bunch of flax, only then can you make, so to speak, the desert bloom. And that's why I think, this isn't the Maharal anymore, and this isn't this Midrash, this is a suggestion I'd like to make. Maybe the reason why the festival that celebrates the giving of the Torah is the only festival that doesn't give us its date and doesn't give us its meaning is to illustrate just this point. It's upon us to make the Torah, so to speak, more meaningful than it would be if we just left it in a box. It's upon us to kind of squeeze out latent, deeper meanings and latent, I suppose, more sublime ethical principles from the narrow letters of the laws of the Torah. If we fail to do that, we live in a desert. But the invitation of the Torah is to engage with Torah Shebal Peh, to engage with the oral law, and thereby make that desert bloom. And of course, the way you do that is by having a festival that doesn't tell you what it is in the written law. It requires the oral law to know that this is a festival about the Torah at all. And that's as it should be. I sometimes think that what we're doing on Simchat Torah is we're celebrating the written law because we've just finished reading it. But on Shavuot, we're celebrating much more. We're celebrating the oral Torah. And it's precisely because we're celebrating the oral Torah that it's not for the written law to tell us what this day's about. It's for the rabbis to tell us what this day's about, because this day is all about rabbis finding meaning that you wouldn't necessarily see if you had an untrained eye and all you had was the written Torah in front of you. Is everyone with me? Does anyone have any questions before I move on to a slightly different Midrash? No? And could you hear me?
Yes, we're fine.
Baruch Hashem. Okay, I'm so pleased to hear. Okay, so what I want to do now, So my suggestions are twofold. Number one, it's not by accident that Shavuot is the only festival mentioned in that list of festivals in Parshat Omer a couple of weeks ago. It's not by accident that it's the only one of the festivals that seems to be in search of an identity. It doesn't have its own date. It doesn't have its own rituals. Well, that makes sense if you believe that the day is a celebration of oral Torah, because if it's a celebration of oral Torah, it should be left to the rabbis to discover that meaning, because that's what oral Torah is all about. So that's one of our questions answered. The second of our questions is, why did the rabbis organize it such that the book of Numbers, the book of Sefer Bamidbar, should always be opened, so to speak, communally? We should always have read at least one Parsha from the book of Bamidbar before we celebrate Shavuot. And the answer to that is perhaps multi-layered. The first is that the Torah itself was given in a desert, and it was given in a desert for a reason, to remind us that our identity is more tightly bound to the Torah than it is even to the promised land, because there will be years when we live without a promised land, but we shall never live without the Torah. That's Rabbi Hirsch's approach. And the Maharal can add to that and say, it also comes to symbolize and make vivid the notion that were it not for the Torah Shabbal Peh, we would still be living in a desert. That notion that we celebrate our synagogues with flowers on the festival of Shavuot is perhaps given more meaning by this metaphor of the desert in bloom. The Torah itself, the written Torah, is a desert. It blooms when it's supplemented with the oral Torah. So that's some of the desert and Shavuot symbolism. But there's another Midrash, a Midrash on this week's Parsha that I'd like to share with you, that I think tells us something more profound about the book of Bamidbar. Not merely that it happened to be in the desert, and that's where the Torah was given, but something about the actual narrative arc of the book of Bamidbar and its religious significance. But it does start, the Midrash does start with this kind of question, like why the desert? What's going on in the desert? Why did God even choose the desert? So there's a verse in the book of Isaiah, chapter 42, verse 11. It says, Yis'u midbar va'arav, right? Let the desert and its towns cry aloud. Chatzeirim Teshev Kedar, the villages where Kedar dwells, whoever Kedar is. Yarnu Yoshvei Sela, let those who dwell in a place called Sela, let them sing out in jubilation. May Rosh Harim Yitzvachu, call out from the peaks of the mountains. So this is image of multiple places praying and calling out to God, but it starts with the desert and its towns. Why the desert and its towns? So the Midrash in Midrash Tanchuma answers our question as follows. Mashal, I'll give you a mashal. I'll give you a parable or an analogy. Lenasi, shenichnas lemedina, to a prince who entered into a state, but it probably means a city-state, into a metropolis. V'ra'u oto b'nei medina uvarchu. The people of the metropolis saw the prince and then they ran away. And I'm not exactly sure what's happening in this story. Why might they run away? What suggestions can you have? I mean, the Midrash tells us nothing. So why might all of the people run away when the king comes to visit? What do you think?
They're afraid. There's
Yeah.
trepidation.
Yeah. Yeah, it could just be that. I mean, you could think more cynically, maybe he's after tax money or something, right? When the king comes to town. But I think Avram, yours is probably the most plausible reading, that it's actually not, it's not comfortable necessarily standing in the presence of such majesty. So they see him, they perhaps kind of acknowledge that he's there, but they can't wait to get away. Okay. Nichnas l'shniya, he goes into a second metropolis. Uvarchu milfanav, and they flee from him. Nichnas le'ir echad chareva, he goes into a destroyed city, a ruined city. Ra'u oto, and they see him. Now I wonder who's living there. It's a destroyed city, it's in the ruins. So maybe it's some kind of homeless people who are finding shelter in a ruined village. They see him, and they begin to praise him. I actually have the English translation here. They begin to praise him. And the prince says, wow, they like me here. This city is better than all the metropolises. Here I will build myself a lodging place. Here will I dwell. Okay. Now I told you last time we learned a Midrash that had a Mashal in it, that there's very often a slight kind of tension between the Mashal and the Nimshal. That's to say between the analogy and the analog. And the Midrash, as it so often does, spells out what it takes the analogy to be saying. And that almost invites us to consider where the tension lies. Okay, so here we are. It says, so the prince said, this city is better than all the metropolises. Here I will build myself a lodging place. Here I will dwell. Similarly, this is the spelling out the Nimshal. Similarly, so too, when the Holy One, blessed be he, came to the sea, it fled from him. As it says, Hayam ra'a vayanos. The sea saw him, saw God, presumably, and the sea fled. That's the splitting of the sea. Okay. He revealed himself on Mount Sinai. It also fled. As stated, the mountains dance like rams. Right, so God comes to the sea, and there's this massive event, but ultimately the event is the sea fleeing. God goes to Mount Sinai, and there's this massive revelation, but ultimately, apparently, the mountain dances away. It runs away. When he came to the desert wasteland, Chareva, like the ruined city in the Mashal, when he came to the desert wasteland, the desert received him and praised him. As it says in our verse, let the desert and its cities lift up their voice. So he said, wow, this city is better than all of the cities. Here I will build a lodging place. When he came down into its midst, they began rejoicing because the Holy One, blessed be he, was dwelling in their midst. As stated, the desert and the arid land shall be glad, and the wilderness shall rejoice and blossom like a crocus. What on earth is going on in this Midrash? I'll stop sharing the screen and maybe even dare to put my camera on. What's going on? Right? We have two cities and a ruined town. And then we're told that the inhabitants of two of the cities fled, and the inhabitants of the third praised God. Okay, but in the Nimshal, there's no distinction between a place and its inhabitants. First of all, the sea is a place and it flees, not its inhabitants. The mountain is a place and it flees, not its inhabitants. And the desert is a place and it praises God, not its inhabitants. And what are these two cities? Like, if you had to describe the seashore of the Red Sea and Mount Sinai and put them into a family, what family of locations do they belong to? Anyone? Like, what do those two places have in common? Mount Sinai and the Red Sea.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
All right, I'm not sure if it's connected, but when I was reading this, I thought of the Midrash where Shem offers the Torah to all the nations of the world, and each one has
Yes.
an excuse. So is there a
Yes.
connection? Yeah, all right.
Yeah, I
And then
like.
right
I like.
there,
Yeah, I
yeah,
like that. There's this notion that there's a pattern between those two midrashim, which is to say that God is kind of looking around for someone to bite, right? And the first comers, the first potential customers, don't want. In the midrash you're talking about, God offers the Torah to multiple nations who all say no before he offers it to us, and we say yes. And likewise, in this midrash, God comes to the sea, and it's deemed somehow inappropriate. The sea runs away. He comes to the mountain at Har Sinai, and the mountain runs away. Comes to the desert, and the desert accepts him. I see the comparison, Abraham. But still, what I'm interested in right now is, like, if you had to describe the Red Sea and Mount Sinai, what do they have in common as locations?
Nothing.
Yes, they do.
nothing.
Nothing. Well, I'll tell you something they have in common. They're a place where a massive miracle happened, right? They're two places where a massive miracle happens. They're not arbitrary places. They're places where massive miracles happened. The thing is, right, when the Red Sea runs away from God, isn't that what he wanted? Right? In the Mashal, the king comes to the town and he's disappointed when all of the people run away. But he comes to the Red Sea and the Red Sea runs away from God. That's what he wanted. That's called the splitting of the Red Sea. That's what led to there being some dry land for the Jews to kind of traverse. Are you with me? Am I making sense?
Yes.
So good. So the Mashal is very confusing, because you might say that the whole point of God coming to the Red Sea is that the Red Sea should run away. Now, what else happened at the Red Sea apart from the Red Sea splitting? The people went through, and what did the people do as they were walking through? Famously,
They sang.
they sang. Okay, and a question you can ask, and I always ask, my dad would always ask the question when we were watching a musical, especially if it was like in the cinema rather than the theater. It's like, how do they all know the words? You know, when people like spontaneously break into song in a musical, and it's so unbelievable because it's supposed to be a new song. So how do they all know the melody, and they all know the words, and they can harmonize with each other, and they all know the choreography? And where's the orchestra hiding? Right? And, you know, there's something kind of surreal almost about the conceit of musical theatre, that we're supposed to kind of suspend our disbelief and just imagine that people can spontaneously break into song. But we're told that when the Jewish people walked through the Red Sea, they did spontaneously burst into song, right? As Yashir Moshe Uvnei Israel. Then Moses and all of the Jewish people sung. And Miriam had a similar experience just with the women as well. Now, there are actually a number of midrashim that try to deal with this question. And according to some, it wasn't such a miracle. What happened is that Moshe sang the first verse and then everyone repeated him. Like, you know, when the army goes marching, or chain gangs are marching, and the leader sings, you know, I don't know, but I've been told. And then everybody else responds, I don't know, but I've been told. So the only one who needed to know the words was Moshe, no miracle. But according to others, that's not right. And it wasn't sung responsively. They really did burst into song. And that midrashic tradition suggests that at the Red Sea, every single Jew experienced prophecy. every single Jew, man, woman, free man, slave, children, everybody, they all experienced prophecy. And that's how they were able to sing the song, and that's how they knew the words. More than that, one of the lines of the Song of the Sea is Ze Eli v'anvehu, which means this is my God and I will glorify him. The word this, Ze, is a demonstrative. A demonstrative means it's a word that only really has meaning in the context of something being pointed to, right? So like you say, Ze Eli v'anvehu, this is my God and I will glorify him. What do you mean this? Where? And the Midrash suggests, well, they had such a vivid experience of God that they were able, so to speak, to point to him directly. In fact, a famous Midrash suggests that even a lowly, illiterate kind of slave man or slave woman saw at the sea prophecies more vivid than Ezekiel warranted to see. Okay. Now, if that's the case, Mount Sinai and the Red Sea are not just places where miracles happened. They're places where revelation occurred. Because what did all of the people hear at Mount Sinai? The voice of God, right? Whether it's actually very ambiguous. If you look at Exodus 19 and Exodus 20, whatever it is, if you look at the various chapters of the book of Exodus, it's left very ambiguous exactly how much they heard. Did they hear just the first 2 commandments? Did they hear all 10 commandments? Did they hear them all? What exactly did they hear? But especially when you read the summary in the book of Deuteronomy in Parshat Vayetchanan, it's clear that they heard God speaking. There are only 2 places in the world where we can say the entire nation experienced collective prophecy. That's the sea and the mountain. And yet in our Midrash, God goes to them and they flee. So given that much background, what do you think the flight of the sea and the flight of the mountain might be symbolizing? Okay, when you pay attention,
reluctance to accept the Torah. It's like it's a little bit too much. we're on our way. We're leaving. We can't take it.
Good. So first of all, these experiences were overwhelming. They were actually too much for us, right? In the case of Mount Sinai, the Jews intercede with Moses and say, "Please, we can't take this anymore." But actually, that's kind of natural, right? How long can you sustain a religious experience for?
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
So what is it that's fleeing? Not the mountain, not the sea, but the experience itself. Those experiences are fleeting.
Yes.
So where in Jewish history did the Jewish people have a sustained and continuous intimate relationship with God?
The Mikdash.
In the Beit HaMikdash, and before that, in the Mishkan, in the portable Beit HaMikdash, right?
Yeah.
And the portable Beit Mikdash was in the wilderness. It was in the desert. And actually, in that time, the Jewish people had a unity that they would, a kind of a unity around their service of God that they would never completely recover. Because by the time we enter the land of Israel, you know, we never really managed to settle each tribe in their ancestral land as we were supposed to. We never quite did it properly. Very often, for large stretches of Jewish history, the temple in Jerusalem was only really servicing the tribe of Judah and Shimon and the Leviim that were there because of the split between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. You know, you'd be hard pressed to find a 40-year period where all of the tribes cooperated pretty much ceaselessly, apart from this one event with the Korach uprising, but pretty much without interruption. The Jewish people cooperated ceaselessly in keeping a tabernacle running for the entire nation to serve God together. It was the desert. It was the wilderness years, when in the Song of Songs, God remembers our youth, right? And in Amos and in other places, in Hosea, I believe, when God remembers falling in love with the Jewish people, it was in the desert. It was in those 40 years where we followed him. Our clothes, they didn't grow old on our bodies. That was a miracle of the 40 years. We didn't have to eat food that we prepared on our own, although we were allowed to, because there was the manna from heaven. This was, in the opening of Emunot V'Dayot, the great philosophical work of Sajid Gaon, he argues that the most unbelievable of all the miracles, the miracle that would have been hardest to convince people happened, is the miracle of the manna, because it happened every single day for 40 years, day in, day out. Perhaps our ancestors around Mount Sinai were blown away by a natural event, some sort of thunderstorm that kind of left an imprint on them. And over the years, it kind of evolved into a story that, oh, we heard God at Mount Sinai. Okay, maybe. But day in, day out, every single day for 40 years, they claim to have been fed by food that fell from heaven. How did we come to believe such a ridiculous claim? And how did we come to believe that our parents did that, and that this was passed down to us in the unbroken chain? How did we come to believe that if it wasn't true? Rav Sajid Gaon thinks the miracle of the manna, because of its longevity, it's not fleeting like the moment on the mountain and like the moment at the sea. Yes, Vicky, you have your hand up.
Yes. All of this business about being in the desert and the Jewish people being together to experience a miracle from God, at the Red Sea and at Sinai, is all connected to the fact that they were totally dependent on God. Yeah. Totally dependent. Their whole experience in the desert was one of total dependency.
It was.
And after that, we're not dependent anymore just on God.
Yes.
Okay. So I think that aspect of it is important to what you're saying.
No, I agree with you. I think, in fact, if you read Bamidbar carefully, one way of understanding the entire story is it's a story of Moshe slowly weaning the Jewish people off of their dependence from God. Why do I say that? Well, according to one Midrashic tradition, the reason that the spies didn't want to enter the land was because they didn't want to give up this desert experience. This desert experience was amazing. Food falls down from heaven. We don't have to fend for ourselves. We're going to go in there, we're going to have to farm it and fight for it and all this stuff. And it's going to be a much more naturalistic kind of we don't want that. So we had 40 years for a new generation to grow up in independence and learn to be autonomous and self-sufficient. And what you'll see is there are a number of episodes in the book of Bamidbar where Moses teaches the Jewish people how oral law works. For instance, the people weren't, some people weren't able to celebrate Pesach because they were impure. And they went and asked their rabbi, and their rabbi came up with this notion, okay, in consultation with God, but it's this notion of Pesach Sheni. The women at the end of the book of Numbers, the daughters of Tzlofchad, they come forward and ask the rabbi, what's going to happen with the inheritance of women? The law, the written law is unclear on that. And you can see what's happening perhaps as us moving from the paradigm of direct prophecy, God reveals himself at the mountain and tells us exactly what to do, to a state of affairs where we have a judiciary, we have prophets, we have kind of institutions of state. We're getting ready for a more autonomous life. And actually, I think if you read the book of Bamidbar through that prism, that's one of the main narrative arcs of the book. It will actually kind of help you to unravel certain puzzles in the text. I'm very much led in this direction by the commentary of Nachmanides to the book of Bamidbar, where he looks at a lot of these things through quite political lenses, especially the attempted revolution in the time of Korach, and that what Moshe is actually trying to do is to put robust institutions in place that will allow the citizens to carry on living a religious, Jewish, meaningful life with less direct divine oversight, right, in a more naturalistic way. But what I think is happening in this Midrash, in Tanchuma, is I think that the Midrash is saying, don't be fooled by the razzmatazz of intense religious experiences. Yes, the Red Sea was amazing. Yes, the theophany, the revelation at Mount Sinai was astonishing. But those experiences are not the sorts of things that sustain a religiously meaningful life. There are people who have these phenomenal conversion experiences and then they lose their motivation. It goes, it disappears. Because razzmatazz has a sell-by date, right? So God went to the sea and it fled. It was supposed to flee, okay? It's important perhaps in your religious life to have those moments, Yom Kippur, Shavuot, where you stand in front of God and you're blown away by his majesty, and you stand there at Mount Sinai and you accept the Torah afresh. Those moments, those highlights of your religious life, those peaks, they're important. That's why God went to the sea. And he knew it would flee, and that was okay. And God went to Mount Sinai and he revealed himself, but the mountain ran away. What I think that means in context is the experience itself was fleeting. The mountain doesn't run away, but the experience you have at Mount Sinai, you know, I remember during the first Gulf War and all the Scud missiles were falling on Israel, and lots of people were saying, wow, this is miraculous. That number of relatively advanced missiles falling on this country and there being so few casualties. I think one person died from a related injury. It was astonishing. And people were openly using the language of miracle. But it wears off, right? And the people that said, oh, miracle, 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 are they still religious today? Are they still observing things today? Does that still have a hold over them? No, because it's like the Red Sea, it flees. And like all miracles, it's like Mount Sinai, it runs away. But the Midbar was different, because the Midbar was 40 years of living with God in the desert. And it wasn't always pleasant. In fact, if you read the book of Bamidbar, it's 40 years of a quite fractious, you know, and difficult, stiff-necked people. But on the other hand, it was constant and sustained religiosity. Even Korach, you know, believed that what he was doing was for the sanctity of the people, and you do have cases, the men run after the women of Midian, where they're flirting with idolatry. On the whole, it's 40 years of kind of concerted dedication to God. And my suggestion, perhaps, is that we have to begin the book of Bamidbar before we have Shavuot, because Mount Sinai runs away and the desert doesn't. And what I mean by that is that Mount Sinai is an important experience, but we shouldn't give it too much weight. The more important religious experiences are the day in, day out experiences one gets from perhaps working at it, from trying to say the Amida every day at the right time of day. It can feel like a chore, it can feel like a pain, but every now and again, if you do that, you'll also feel that you're living your life in the presence of another. And it's nowhere near as intense, and it's nowhere near as immediate as Mount Sinai and the Red Sea, where they could say Zeh Eli v'Anvehu, and every single person was a prophet. But on the other hand, it's more reliable, and it's more sustainable, and it's those lesser moments of religious experience, the manna falling in the desert rather than the pyrotechnic show that we saw at Sinai. It's those smaller moments of religious experience that really sustain continued religiosity and religious growth. So perhaps the idea is, don't dismiss the book of Bamidbar. Don't dismiss those 40 years of seemingly endless quarreling and wandering around the desert, because actually in those years, in the midst of the difficulties and in the midst of the hard work that would need to be done in order to be fully aware of the majesty of God in the midst of such a stiff-necked and unruly people, don't dismiss the fact that it's there in the gritty realia of a life lived wandering through the wilderness of the many wildernesses of this world. It's there that we really meet God. It's there that we have the experiences which can actually sustain religiosity in the long term. And that's why, sure, enjoy Shavuot, stay up all night, receive the Torah, but start reading Sefer Bamidbar first, because in the words of the Midrash, the mountain will dance away, but the desert can be made to bloom. Of course, as we saw from the Maharal, the desert only blooms if we put some of ourselves into it, right? If we invest ourselves. And that's again part something to do with the relationship between the oral Torah and the written Torah. The oral Torah being that mechanism through which we find the bread in the midst of the wheat, and we find the fabric in the midst of the flax. So that's my little introduction to the book of Bamidbar via its relationship in the calendar to Shavuot. A little bit earlier than 5 minutes earlier than I said. So if anyone has any questions or comments or criticisms, all ears. And let me just apologize for the beginning of the shir, getting a stable connection, but it seems like we managed in the end. Thank God. Okay. Okay. Well, I hope this was a pyrotechnic razzmatazz religious experience for you all, and that in the aftermath we'll all find ourselves collecting manna in a sustainable religious experience through the wildernesses of our life that we shall make blossom.
Thank you.
Fabia, you have your hand up. Safta, as I call it.
I just wondered if you have any thoughts about today, Yom Yerushalayim, connecting it in any way, because Yom Yerushalayim is such a rooted in the place.
Yes, that's right. And Yom Yerushalayim is particularly difficult at the moment because it celebrates in part, I mean, the miracles of the 6-day war and all these amazing things that to somebody with religious Zionist sensibilities, one can't look at those events and deny the hand of God and the miracles. So there's a lot to celebrate, and yet we still haven't sorted out the consequences of the 6-day war. The administration of the lands conquered in the West Bank and Gaza, and the exact status of Jerusalem. We annexed Jerusalem, and yet functionally it basically remains a divided city. It remains, there's East Jerusalem and there's West Jerusalem, and they're like two different worlds. So it partially feels like we're celebrating something that we're celebrating all the miracles, but vis-a-vis Jerusalem, we're celebrating something that hasn't really happened yet. We're still almost fighting it out, and I'm ashamed to say that on both sides, that fighting has been quite, shall we say, ugly. However, and that's happening right now. Faber, I think the question you ask, when you think through like the eyes of Rav Hirsch. Now, Rav Hirsch wasn't really in favor of the proto-Zionism that was growing around him. Some of his later Talmidim, his intellectual heirs, say yes, but after 1947 and the partition plan, he would have been pro-Zionist. Who knows? He didn't live to see it. However, I think a Hirschian approach to Yom Yerushalayim would say, well, there's Jerusalem, the place, and there's also Jerusalem, the idea. And Jerusalem, the idea, is something worth celebrating. And I think that when those paratroopers arrived at the Kotel, for one glorious moment in our history, secular, Haredi, modern Orthodox, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, you name it, Israeli diaspora, they were united, and they felt the gravity of that moment. And even if the aftermath didn't bring with it everything we may have wanted it to bring, I suppose there's two things to say. One is that moment itself is worthy of celebration, because gosh, they don't come too often when the Jewish people are completely, seemingly united and almost aware of the presence of the divine in their midst. That happened, and that happened in living history. That's worth celebrating. But the other thing is, I suppose, what our Midrash is saying is that those Mount Sinai moments, those Yom Yerushalayim moments, where you stand at Har Habayit and it's in, Har Habayit biyadenu, HaKotel biyadenu, those moments are intense, but they don't last long. The real work is trying to make a just and righteous society in the middle of this desert in which we live. The real work is to try and find ways of making the desert in which we live bloom. So I suppose the real work is trying to make the reality of Jerusalem closer to the ideal of Yerushalayim. So it's okay if one day a year we celebrate what was a kind of Har Sinai moment on Yom Yerushalayim, so long as the rest of the year we rededicate ourselves to the actual hard work that needs to be done to make Jerusalem a truly united city. And part of that involves our relationship with the residents of East Jerusalem. And that obviously that takes two to tango, and it's certainly not simple, and I don't have the answers, but that's what we need to work at. So
I'm grateful for this talk for a personal reason. I have a friend who lives over a huge building site right by the train tracks here in Jerusalem. And over a period of a year or two, she's taken photographs of the building site and of the people in the building site. And in honor of Yom Yerushalayim, she's put up all the photographs on the building boards in front of it, the building site. Now, we walking past can't ever see what goes on there. So she's revealed to the people walking past what's going on. And I honestly didn't think about why that was significant. But your talk today made me think that, yes, we should celebrate what goes on day to day in Jerusalem, as well as the 67
Yeah,
victory.
67 was amazing, but if we lose,
Yes.
but if we lose focus of that day-to-day stuff, then it was all for nothing. And
Yeah.
and that's why in the Midrash God says, "Oh, I came to the Red Sea. Sure, I was there, but it fled. I came to Mount Sinai. Sure, it was there, but it ran away. It was the desert that that really took me in, because I was there for 40 years, day in, day out. And
Yes.
it's the day-to-day stuff that matters. I totally agree. Jerusalem is no exception to that. Anyway, thank you, Fabia, Safta, as I call you, but Fabia to everybody else. This has been a pleasure. Thank you.